As you begin the journey of implementing a Stripe integration, we want to arm you with a really powerful tool that will help you build, test, and manage your integration. So enter the star of today's show, the Stripe CLI, or the Stripe command line interface. It's a command line utility for securely testing your webhooks, tailing your API request logs, creating, updating, and retrieving API objects, and much more that really just speeds up the common tasks and workflows. So the content in today's episode acts as a foundational reference point to other developer office hours episodes. And so whether you're just getting started or a seasoned Stripe integrator, this is going to be a great place to jump in. Welcome back to Stripe Developer Office Hours. I'm CJ, Developer Support Engineer here at Stripe, and the Stripe CLI has become an invaluable part of my workflow. I'm really excited to share it with you. So let's take a quick look at the agenda for today. So to begin, we'll install and connect the Stripe CLI to our account, and then we'll look at some of the API resource commands and pair those with another command line tool called JQ. And next, we'll explore the webhook commands that allow us to listen for webhook events and also trigger those event notifications. And then we'll wrap with just a lightning round of the quick wins and other utilities that are currently available as part of the Stripe CLI. So the first thing I wanted to do is jump over to the wiki page for the Stripe CLI's GitHub and show you this installation docs. This is where we're really going to start going here. Or get going. So for Mac, you can use Homebrew to install. For Linux, for various distributions, we have some installation instructions here, and we also have a couple of ways you can install with Windows or as a Docker image. So since I'm on a Mac, I'm going to use this brew install command, and I'm using iTerm today, but really you can use any terminal. That doesn't matter. If you're on a Mac and you're really just sort of getting started, you can use Command Space to open up the Spotlight or Alfred finders, and then type terminal or type iTerm to open up this window. Okay, so I'm just going to paste in the brew install command, and this is going to install the Stripe CLI. This is going to be our command line utility. And as soon as the Stripe CLI is installed, there are some things that we can do. So the very first thing I want to do is just type Stripe. And that'll show me all the commands that are available to run, and kind of the way that we use the Stripe command. So the way that this works is we type Stripe and then a space and then our command. So some of the webhook commands, listen and trigger, we'll get to those later. Some Stripe commands, we can do log tailing and look at the status of Stripe. So maybe we want to just check the version of Stripe CLI that's installed. We can say Stripe-V. Note that this 1.3.5 is the version of the Stripe CLI. That's not the version of your API. So you'll want to look in the Stripe dashboard for your API version, which is usually, it looks like a date, year, month, day, separated by hyphens. So the other thing we can do here now is we can say Stripe status, and that'll tell us the status of the API. It shows us that all services are online. That's great. Now, the next thing on our list is to connect the Stripe CLI to our Stripe account. So when we have access to a browser, so in this environment, I can open a browser and successfully authenticate. You can say Stripe login. So we say Stripe login and hit enter. It shows us a pairing code, so reform, favor, prize, right. We want to confirm that that matches when we open the browser. So we're going to hit enter to open the browser. And then we are shown our pairing code, and we can pick which account, which of our Stripe accounts that we want to use with this authentication of the Stripe CLI. And so I'm going to say, yep, that pairing code looks right. So I'm going to allow access, and we're done. So I can just close that tab and go back to the CLI. I'm sorry, back to the terminal. One thing worth noting too is that you have to be logged into your Stripe dashboard in your default browser before you hit open, or otherwise you'll have to log in for that to work, which is totally another valid path. Okay, so now that we've logged in, we have access to all of our Stripe data directly in the command line. So we can say things like Stripe plans list, and that will list the plans for the Stripe account that we just authenticated with. So that's pretty cool. The way that this works is there are some special keys that are stored in the config. So we can look at Stripe config -- list, and that shows us the Stripe keys that were created just for this specific setup. So our default account is the one that we just authenticated to. That's our like demo account. If you wanted to, or maybe sometimes you'll have multiple Stripe accounts, maybe one's for test, one's for production, maybe you have like a CI account. So if you need to manage and kind of jump between those different accounts, you can use the project name. So we can say Stripe login -- project, project name CI, for example, to create another config. So now we have a new pairing code, we hit enter, and then when we're prompted here, we can select the other account. So maybe this is the CI account that we want to authenticate with. So Glitzwell, that matches our pairing code that we were just shown. So we'll allow access and connect. And so we're done here again. We can go back to the terminal. And now if we say Stripe config -- list, we'll see that we have both a default and a CI config. It's pretty handy. So if you are in an environment where you don't have access to a browser and you can't pop that open, for example, if you're running this on like a CI machine or something that doesn't have access to a browser, you can use the config set command. So you can say Stripe config -- set, and then maybe you want to set your live mode API key to something like sk test xxx or sk live in this case. And what that will do is just it'll set the key for you. So you can go to your Stripe dashboard, grab some keys that you need to use for CI, and then use Stripe config set as part of maybe your build process. And that will set your keys. So we can look again, Stripe config list to list out our config, and you'll see that this has been updated. Cool. So that's really how you get connected with the Stripe CLI. Let's move on to part 2, API resources. So you have full access to make API requests to your Stripe account directly with the CLI. So what I think might make sense is let's try to create a customer and then subscribe that customer to a plan all from the CLI. So one thing you might want to know is like, what are the resources that are available? So if we say Stripe resources, that will list out all the different resources that you can access. Pretty handy. So we find customers in here. That's great. So we can say Stripe customers. What does that do? Okay, well, Stripe customers takes an operation, and here's the different operations that we can use: create, delete a discount, list, retrieve, update, and then some parameters. Okay, cool. So what if we say Stripe customers create, and maybe if we add the -- help flag, that'll give us some more information about what we can pass. So here in the request parameters, these are just like some of the params that we can pass. So if we say Stripe customers create -- balance or -- coupon, we can pass in arguments that are used to create that customer. So another thing though that I want to do is in order for a Stripe customer to have like a payment method that's used when they are billed for Stripe billing with a subscription, they have to have like an invoice settings default payment method, which isn't in the list of like default request parameters. And so if I'm not like 100% sure what options are available to pass to that customer, I can say Stripe open API, and that will open up the API docs for the full API reference. So then once I'm here, I can search for customers and go to create customer, and I see all the arguments that I can pass in to create a customer, which is pretty neat. So we have the payment method. That'll be important because we want to attach a payment method that we're going to use for billing. And then down here under invoice settings, we have the invoice settings default payment method. So this is a nested argument. So I want to show you both how to send those like top level request args and then also some nested ones. Another thing to point out while we're here in the API ref is that the Stripe CLI is one of the like language options that you can use from the dropdown to see what the format of the request might look like. So maybe for your integration, if you're building it in Ruby, this is the code that you would use to create a customer with a description. And with the Stripe CLI, it looks just like this. So Stripe customers create -- description and a description. Okay, so let's head back over to the terminal, and we'll say Stripe customers create, and we'll give this customer an email, and it'll be just like CLI test@example.com. And let's also give them a payment method, which is PM card Visa. So this payment method right here is going to be the token of the payment method that you tokenized on the client with Stripe.js or Stripe iOS or Stripe Android. But when you're in test mode, you can use these test tokens. So one of while you're looking at the test cards in the docs, you'll see these 4242 numbers, which are really common. But then in these other tabs, you have options to use these shortcut tokens that are pre-built in order to test different scenarios for you. So I'm just going to use this PM card Visa as sort of the card that we're going to use on this customer. So by passing the payment method at the top level, I'm attaching the payment method to the customer. And then I also wanted to pass this nested invoice settings. Because it's nested, you can't really use like the dash argument for the request arg. So we have to say -d, and then I can say invoice settings default payment method like this, because the default payment method is nested inside of the invoice settings argument. So it's kind of like attribute style, the same way that you would see with curl or with like a query string parameter. And I can again pass PM card Visa. So now this is actually going to create a customer through the API, and we get back the data, the JSON data for that newly created customer. And we have this ID, we have this customer ID, which is great. So the next thing we can do is we can say like Stripe customers retrieve, and then pass in that customer ID. We get back the same data. Super handy. So the next thing I want to do is create a subscription. Now that we have a customer, they have payment methods. They have a payment method set, and they have their invoice settings, default payment method set. That's great. So now we can say Stripe subscriptions create. And again, if we do -- help, that'll tell us all the different things that we can pass in when creating a subscription. So tons of different options for creating subscriptions. For now, I just need customer, and then I need to tell it like which plan to subscribe to. So I'm going to say Stripe customer. Oops, we lost our ID here. Let's go grab that customer ID and oops. Subscriptions, Stripe subscriptions create customer, and then we also want to say -d items. So this is how we set the plan. Plan equals, and then I have a plan with the ID movies set up in here, so I can say create a subscription for this new customer with the plan movies. And look at that, I've got a new active subscription. I've charged the customer, and it's successfully up and running. And this is so cool. I love that that you can do everything directly from the command line. It's so neat. So now we have this latest invoice. So something we might do is just grab that ID and say, you know, like Stripe invoices retrieve, and then pass in the invoice ID just to see, hey, is the status of that invoice paid? And it is. So that's super handy way to kind of just like poke around and explore. We created a customer, we subscribed them to a plan, and so this is one of the examples that you can go through to like interact with those resources directly through the API with the Stripe CLI. So you can kind of think of the CLI as a command line interface and your dashboard as a graphical user interface that are really helpful when trying to determine what things you're building for your integration. Okay, the next thing I wanted to show is that not all of the API endpoints are accessible with your restricted keys that come with the CLI. For instance, if you have connected accounts, so if you're a platform and you're debugging with connected accounts and you try to say something like Stripe accounts list, you'll receive this error that says the provided key arcade test blah 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 does not have the required permission for this endpoint. So in this case, what I like to do is pass in my key explicitly with --API-key, and then I store my my secret key, which is not the restricted key, but the secret key. I store it in an environment variable because I'm doing this a lot, but you could pass in your secret key right here directly, and that would use your secret key instead of the restricted key. And here we get all of the connected account data back. So that's pretty neat. Okay, so that's how you can pass sort of an API key if your restricted key doesn't have enough permission. Okay, the next thing I want to do is show you how to pair this with JQ. So what is JQ? JQ is a command line tool, sort of like sed, but for processing JSON directly in the command line. Very handy. And because the output of a lot of these API resource operations is JSON data, we can interact with that JSON data directly with JQ. So if we say something like Stripe customers list, maybe our goal is to create like a CSV file of the Stripe ID for a customer and their name and email, for instance. So we say Stripe customer list dash JQ. It's a whole bunch of methods that you can call with JQ, and I'd point you to the documentation here. So this is like the docs for JQ. Really powerful stuff. Highly recommend it. So if we take Stripe customers list and we pipe it into JQ and we say dot or maybe keys, that'll tell us what the keys are in the JSON object that was passed to JQ. So there's data, has more object, and URL. So in this case, we want to look at data, and we know that data is in an array, and we want to pull out the IDs of all the different customers. So now we have, just like a list of customer IDs. That's pretty neat. JQ, you can also like pass JQ lists of, or like these long expressions where you can compose different pieces together. So we can say .id, .name, .email, and then maybe we pipe that to @CSV as part of JQ to create a CSV file that has the Stripe ID, the name, and the email of the customers directly in our account. Hey, maybe we want a few more of those. We can say -- limit 100. That's like the maximum. So let's get the 100 customers here, and you see their names and emails directly as a CSV. Really powerful stuff, and pairing the Stripe CLI with JQ definitely improves my workflow on the day-to-day. So I wanted to share that and point that out. Okay, I think that's the end of part 2. Let's move on to Act 3 of today's show, which is how to use the Stripe CLI with webhooks. So oftentimes when you are building a third-party integration that uses webhooks, you might set up some sort of tunneling software, third-party tunneling software, so that you can provide a public URL to which the third party can send post requests that you can then test your local webhook server. So you want to tunnel from some public domain to your local machine to receive requests, but that's like it's kind of tough to get everything all set up and configured. So the Stripe CLI makes this incredibly simple. There is a command called listen, and so you can say Stripe listen, and the Stripe listen command is going to establish a direct connection from Stripe to your computer and allow Stripe to deliver webhook event notifications directly to your machine through the Stripe listen, which is it's incredibly powerful, and you avoid having to use any third-party tools in order to tunnel the requests from Stripe to your local development machine. Now in production, you'll have to go set up a real webhook handler and test it out and test that your public domain is actually available and receiving these post requests from Stripe. But in development, you can use Stripe listen to have those events forwarded directly to your local machine. Now, when you're using Stripe Listen with the Stripe CLI, you don't actually need to configure any webhook endpoint in your Stripe dashboard or with the API. So by saying Stripe Listen, the CLI is going to configure a webhook endpoint for you inside the dashboard that will forward those webhook events directly to your machine. Really cool, really powerful stuff. So yeah, so this is how it works. You can just say, let's see, Stripe listen. Okay. And so now Stripe is listening for events to happen on our Stripe account. Here you see the webhook secret. So if your webhook endpoint handler is doing signature verification, you can use this webhook secret to verify those signatures and test your signature verification locally. So right now it's just kind of like open, waiting for some event to happen. So there's the first way we can trigger an event to happen or make an event happen is just by creating some object in the API that will cause an event to happen. Also, while we're here, let me show you a bunch of different event types, or where to find the list of event types. So if you head back over to the API ref, you can also do Stripe Open API, and you go to types of events here. There's a huge list, account.updated, and then this massive list, customer subscription pending update expired, file.created, invoice.updated. So these are all the event types. The event types are usually this like dot delimited thing with the object type and then some action that's taken on it. Very long list, so that's where you might find the different types of events. So if we wanted to trigger an event, one thing that we could do is just make the API call that will cause that event to be fired. So if we want a customer.created event to happen, we might just say Stripe customers create, and that will create a customer and result in a customer.created event happening. And here's the event ID, pretty cool. Sometimes it's difficult to set up all the different API requests you need in order to trigger a specific event. For instance, the checkout session completed event is particularly difficult to trigger directly from the CLI and to automate, because there's a couple of different things that need to happen in there. You have to have, the customer has to go to checkout, they have to attach their payment method, a customer is created, payment intent is created and then succeeded, and then a charge succeeds, and then finally the payment intent, or the checkout session completed event fires. So in those cases where it's where it can be really difficult to fire or to test triggering a specific event, there are a handful that have already been pre-implemented for you as part of the Stripe CLI. And that is exposed through the trigger command. So we can say Stripe trigger and then pass trigger a list, pass trigger the event type that we want to fire. So here in the supported events, there's a big list, and one that I wanted to show is checkout session completed. So if we say Stripe trigger checkout session completed event, then a whole number of API requests are being made in order to result in this checkout session completed. So we see a payment intent was created, and then a payment intent is going to succeed. We'll have a charge created and a customer created, and a number of different things. So here we have like a whole bunch of events that are firing just so that we can get that checkout session completed event to fire. Super handy. So you kind of just say Stripe trigger checkout session completed, and then you'll see that event be published to your listener here. Okay, one other thing that we can do is we can say Stripe listen -- events to pass specific event types that we want to listen for. So maybe we want to fire up this listener, but we don't want to receive all of the fire hose of events that are happening on our account. So maybe we really only want to listen to checkout session completed and payment intent.succeeded or something. So we can say Stripe -- events and pass in the list of event types to filter down to just those event types that we want to listen to. So I'm going to refire the checkout session completed event down here, and we'll see that just those two events are displayed. So we're kind of just like filtering out which events we want to listen to. So we get the payment intent succeeded, and then we get the checkout session completed event. And again, these the events that we're listening to are coming from Stripe. So the Stripe trigger command is making API requests to Stripe that is creating the objects, and when those objects are created and actions are taken, they result in events that are being published, and those notifications for the events are being published to our account, and the account inside of Stripe sees that we have a Stripe CLI listener hooked up, and so those event notifications are being delivered directly to our local machine. Really, really cool, really handy stuff. Now, the one thing that we haven't done yet is passed this to a local server. But one more thing before we do that, I wanted to show you, if you add on the -J, this is kind of handy too. You can output all of the JSON data for an event. So if you tack on -J, that'll print out the JSON for the incoming thing. So by default, also the Stripe listen is going to receive events with the API version, which is the default API version of your account. So they'll be formatted as the data for your API or for your account's default API version. You can also pass -L if you want the events in the latest version of the API, but you can't specify like a specific API version, just like your default account's API version or the latest, and that's it. So here we get, like in the log for our Stripe listen, we see the JSON output for the events that were published to our endpoint, which is super cool, super handy. Okay, moving on. So this is great. We're having events delivered to our local machine, but I'm a web developer and I'm implementing a webhook handler, and I want to know what my webhook endpoint is doing. So how can I use the Stripe CLI to test my webhook handler? So the way this works is we can forward those events that are happening to a local webhook server. So I have a web server here that I'm going to fire up, and this is going to be this is a local server. It's a Rails server. It's listening on localhost 3000. And so when I say Stripe listen, I can forward to localhost 3000/webhooks. This is like the local path to my local server that I want to have those webhooks, the webhook notifications published to. So we've got our webhook listener. Let's again trigger checkout session completed. And so we see the payment intent created happened, and we got a 200 back from our local post to our local webhook server. If we go over here, we can see in the server log that those post requests are coming in, which is pretty neat. So we got one post request, and then we should get a flood of a bunch more as we receive those other events that happen. And then finally, we handle this checkout session completed event. So that's pretty neat. You can set up your local server with its webhook handler to listen for those events and then receive those. A couple other things to add about events and webhooks before we move on, and that is these are the IDs of the events. So EVT_, that's the event that just fired. This is this checkout session completed event, and what you can do is one of the API resources that's available is the events resource. So we can say Stripe events retrieve, and we can pass in that event ID. Okay, that's cool. We got back all the data for that event. That's great. But let's say that for some reason our webhook handler had a bug and it failed to process this specific event. And what we really want to do is just reprocess the event. What you can do is you can say Stripe events resend with that specific ID for the event ID. And when you hit enter, it will re-trigger that event and refire it to your server. So that's really powerful, super fun, and something I really wanted to share. Okay, so that's how you use the Stripe CLI to work with webhooks. So there's still a couple more things that I wanted to show you. Trying to make it quick. Okay, so Stripe Serve is a tool for setting up quickly a local file server. So let's say you have just like a basic HTML page. So we'll just say like, maybe we have like an H1 that says, "Hi, Stripe integrators." Okay. Then we can say Stripe Serve, and that will create a local static file server that you can then use to test your local static files. Super handy. There's a number of different ways you can set up static servers and things, but it just comes for free with Stripe CLI, which is so nice. Okay, another really cool one that I wanted to share is Stripe samples. So you can say Stripe samples, and there's a couple commands here. So a Stripe sample is a GitHub repository and a collection of code examples for that demonstrate how to integrate some of our products. And so there's repositories up on GitHub that you can explore, and they generally come with a client directory and a server directory, and the servers support generally many different languages. So Ruby, Python, PHP, Go. And so one thing that you can do with Stripe samples is directly from the Stripe CLI, you can pull down a Stripe sample and have it auto configure your API keys. This is so cool. So we can say Stripe samples list, and this will tell us all the different Stripe samples that are available right now. So we can just go through here and say like, oh, we can learn how to accept a basic card payment. That's cool. Accept a card. Maybe this setup subscriptions one looks good. So we can say Stripe samples create, and then pass in Stripe samples create, and then pass in the name of that Stripe sample. And that's going to download and say which server do you want to use? Like, what is your backend language? Java, Node, Python, Ruby. I think I'm feeling like Ruby is a good good option today. So we have now this new setup subscriptions directory. And in here, I can just jump right into server and say Ruby server. And yeah, that fires up another localhost 4242. And I can refresh the page. And hey, look at that. I've already got a Stripe sample up and running in like 2 seconds. So you can explore the code that is behind this too, right? Like you can, if we jump back over here, you can say, what does that server look like? How is it implemented? This is the Ruby code that's backing that server. Very cool stuff. Okay, so that's Stripe samples. Yeah, as a quick recap, we covered how to install and configure the CLI, how to connect it to your Stripe account, and use the config command to set API keys if you're using the CLI. Outside of an environment that has a browser. We also showed you how to interact with API objects and create, update. Finally, we showed you Stripe Serve and some Stripe samples. A couple things we didn't cover that I think are worth mentioning. If you just say Stripe here and then start playing around with some of these commands, completion will allow you to, or it generates like the bash completion command. So you may have seen I said Stripe cuss or like CU, and then I hit tab and that'll autocomplete to customers. And then I can say RE and that'll autocomplete to retrieve. So bash completion will help you there. It's pretty neat. Log tailing, we didn't cover that. So that's helpful for looking at the logs as they're happening on your account. The fixtures command, this is like a really advanced version of trigger. So you can implement your fixtures as JSON documents that can be a series of API requests that you want to make. So you can kind of like build a custom trigger command that can automate a number of different API requests in sequence for you. We talked about samples. Open is, again, to open those quick links in the docs. And feedback is a great way for you to tell us what you think about the CLI, how we can improve, where we might be able to make this useful tool even more useful. So those are a couple things we did not cover in depth. I really hope this was useful for you. And again, this is really just a foundational tool. Something that's really important that I really want you to know is that you are not alone in building your integration. We are here with you and right by your side, and we'd be more than happy to help chat through any questions you have about your integration or best practices. Come hang out with us on IRC. We're in the Freenode Stripe channel. Otherwise, if you wanted to reach out and get assistance for a non-technical question, you can always reach out to support.stripe.com. That's a great avenue. Yeah, so until next time, cheers.